Welcome to episode 334 of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. I'm a retired agent on a mission to show you who the FBI is and what the FBI does through my books, my blog, and my podcast case reviews with former colleagues. Today, we get to speak to, once again, retired agents Vince Pankoke Jr. and Tom Myers, who, in part 2 of this 2-part episode, continue their review of Operation Dilido. You can check out episode 333, part 1, to hear Vince and Tom's bio, or you can read about their FBI careers and awards in this episode's show notes at jerrywilliams.com. But let me remind you about Operation Dilido, a Group 1 Colombian Cali Cartel drug undercover investigation targeting drug lord Julio the Gun and his Miami-based lieutenant, Nando. The case relied on surveillance and wiretap coverage of multiple cell phones, hard lines, pagers, and was one of the Department of Justice's first roving T3 intercepts from microphones placed within vehicles. Vince Pankoke was one of Operation Dilido's case agents, along with retired agents Henry Mercadal and Martin Suarez. Tom Myers was a new agent assigned to assist on the case, one of the FBI's most significant drug investigations in the 1990s. And don't forget, Vince talks about his work on the Anne Frank project at the end of this case review. In your podcast app's description of this episode, you'll find links to where you can join my reader team, where I talk about crime fiction, and you can learn about the FBI and books, TV, and movies. There's also a link to where you can buy me a cup of coffee and discover my nonfiction book, FBI Myths and Misconceptions, and my 2 FBI crime novels, Pay to Play and Greedy Givers, all available as ebooks and paperbacks wherever books are sold, and audiobooks on Audible and Spotify. Thank you for your support. Now here's the show. Me again with just a quick reminder of what was happening at the end of part 1. Vince and Tom, along with the rest of the Operation Dilido team, were aware from wiretap intercepts on Julio Correa and Nando's phones and bugs in their vehicles that a new load of cocaine was coming in. Task force officers had located a rental truck suspected to be transporting the cocaine and had tracked it arriving at a warehouse facility.
That started an all-night surveillance on that warehouse, because what the surveillance could see was that we know they went to just pick the truck up, but what did they have in the truck? We weren't really sure.
Right. You weren't sure if they had actually gotten the shipment inside the truck, or you have an empty truck and they're going to go get the shipment.
Yeah. And even to this day, as Vince is explaining portions of it, you didn't know what was happening because we didn't have a common communication medium. You had maybe the bureau radio and you would get a piece of the story there, and kind of makes sense when they explain it afterwards. But we're moving so fast that it's hard to keep up with how everybody evolved this entire caper.
But the surveillance there saw the truck backed in, and it was a very large Penske rental truck, and they saw them unloading something out of the back of it with like a lift gate. So the big question is, okay, what do? Do we hit it right then, or do we wait and let them finish doing what they're doing and then try to go in afterwards? And those are one of those game time decisions. And we actually guessed right. But what we decided to do was, let's wait. Let's let them finish offloading. The workers only stayed for a little bit after they offloaded it. They locked the warehouse up, and then they drove the truck back and returned it.
What is the advantage of waiting?
Well, it allowed us, instead of having to make a split-second decision, it allowed us to think about it a little bit and say, okay, they offloaded what they had, so they didn't take any drugs with them. If we are suspecting that there is drugs in that warehouse at this point, which the intercepts from the phones tended to indicate that there was something in there. But what if we went in and there wasn't anything in there and we actually reacted too early? And whatever they put in that warehouse, maybe the drugs weren't there yet. And then we blow the whole case again after all this work, after all this time.
And there was always the possibility the entire thing could be a MacGuffin to smoke out any heat they have on them. They're just putting that whole thing together, and they spend $200 on, running a truck around to see if anybody's going to come over and surveil their warehouse.
Possibility.
We were pretty sure, but, we already had these guys playing games with us. So it was like you were losing your mind at this point. You just didn't know.
So we talked with our AUSA, and he suggested, okay, let's get a surreptitious search warrant where we don't have to notify anybody. We can articulate to the judge. And now this is like at 10 o'clock at night. And it took till about 1 o'clock till we ended up with the search warrant and somebody to pick the lock to allow us in. And this is all pre-cameras days. Nowadays, people probably have cameras on all their warehouses and workplaces. And luckily for us, there wasn't an alarm at this warehouse. It was a rental warehouse. So we didn't suspect that. But we were able to get a surreptitious search warrant. And myself and one of the City of Miami detectives went up with the locksmith who picked the lock for us, let us in, and with a couple flashlights, looked around, found some lights to turn on. And inside the warehouse, and it was a fairly large warehouse, but there was probably about a dozen giant chlorine cylinders, the metal cylinders that they use to export chlorine, probably about 2.5 feet in diameter. And what would you say, Tom?
Yeah,
7, 8
I measured them, man. No, they were 10.
10 foot long.
Yeah, because the truck was that wide and they needed that Tommy lift. I'm the evidence guy. So yeah, I'm the forensics guy. So it was exactly that. And we knew certain trucks could only sustain that. And we had broken the coating. I'm sorry, I'm breaking your flow. Back to our story. Vince.
No,
yeah, go for it. Yeah.
So we're in there and we're wondering, okay, I'm looking at all these cylinders. I'm looking at also at different equipment that they were probably going to use to cut into these cylinders. So while the surveillance team is guarding us so that in case the bad guys come back, they can warn us to get out of there, I decide we're going to try to inspect in one of these cylinders to see if there's anything in it. So I went over to it. I rolled one. It was heavy. I don't know whether it's heavy because there's something in it like cocaine or whether it's just the weight of the cylinder itself. But I decided, okay, we're going to cut into it. And I'm on the phone and the radio talking to the supervisor and Henry and everybody outside. And I'll never forget the supervisor, Rick Leahy, says, "Hey, Vince, like before you cut into it, are you concerned at all that there could be something dangerous inside there?" And I hesitated for a minute and I said, "Listen, at this point, Rick, I don't care. If it blows up, albeit, we had experienced the highs and the lows of the case. We were all so tired. We were going on at this point about 18 months working on the case. I just looked at it and said, there is a God. He put this here in front of us. We willed cocaine to be in these cylinders."
You did say it was labeled, though, didn't you, Vince?
Labeled chlorine.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yes.
Let me ask a quick question because you have this search warrant. Does the warrant cover you actually looking into this cylinder?
It does. It does.
Okay.
Yeah,
okay.
We worded it in such a way because we knew they offloaded something. So we worded it in such a way that it would authorize us to sneak in and sneak out, but also to examine the interior and we were not required to leave an inventory, which is always something that is required when you serve a search warrant. Anything that you would seize or take, you're required to leave an inventory sheet. And it allowed us to delay the production of an inventory sheet just in case we got in there and maybe we didn't find any drugs. We would be able to sneak back out, close the door, and wait for them to come back. So anyway, we found a saw, couple metal blades, And I know, Jerry, I sent you a picture of the cylinder that we cut into, a very crude, probably 6-inch by 4-inch cut into the cylinder. And when it finally pierced through, it didn't explode. It didn't expel anything. So I figured, okay, all right, we're safe. And once I was able to create a big enough hole to take a flashlight and look in, I was able to see welded within this giant cylinder was this giant metal box, which again, at this point, I know it contains some type of contraband because chlorine cylinders are empty, meant to carry liquid chlorine. This one had a welded metal box in it. And so we found a very long drill bit and a drill. We were able to pierce through the metal box, pull the drill out, and all over the drill was a white powder consistent with cocaine. Not only that, but anybody that's worked drugs, and especially cocaine, knows that it has a distinct chemical smell to it based on the chemicals they use to refine the coca. The minute that I cut the hole, the inspection hole, I could smell cocaine. So I knew that when that drill went through that metal box, we were going to be able to pull it out. And when I pulled it out, the look on the Miami detective's face, I mean, it was pure elation. I was on a high. And the first thing we did was radio out, and everybody on the surveillance team that was out there waiting went crazy. But the number one question was, well, how much is her? How much is her? How would we know? We have no idea.
How many cylinders are in the warehouse?
There were about 12 cylinders, but we had no idea how much cocaine fit into this box. And it turned out that, combined with all of them, there was over 2,000 kilos of cocaine that were secreted in the boxes in the various cylinders. Well, at that point, we knew we had them. But now what do? We found it has cocaine. It's about 2 a.m. They're going to be coming back come morning, and they would notice this. So
yeah, the big drilled hole in the middle of their cylinder.
Oh my gosh. So we decided collectively with the AUSA, we need to do a takedown. So from the time that we found it up until about 6 a.m., phone calls were being made all through Miami for every agency to scramble everybody to the Miami office and get your assigned packet of people that we need to arrest. Plus, we had to leave a basic arrest team there for the people who were coming back to the warehouse in the morning.
Now, did you have packets? Had you already started putting together packets?
No.
Oh, so you had to do all of this work.
We had to do it all. But luckily, our analyst, Marianne French, had folders, informational folders on every subject and kept them up to date on where they were because sometimes they moved around. This group didn't own much in the form of property or vehicles, only because they were afraid of it being seized. So that's why they constantly used rental vehicles. They could switch them out at any moment. And they would either live in luxury rental homes or luxury rental apartments.
And multiple IDs, too. They would multiple IDs, yeah. So you never knew who you were getting. And they lived out of P.O. boxes, too.
Yeah, they wouldn't get mail at their residential addresses. Yeah. They used P.O. boxes.
In those days, you went to the Postal Service or Better Business Bureau, I think, it had a guide on what were your mail drops. But they weren't always up to date. So they'd find these places. And sure enough, the guy lived in a little tiny box. We used to joke because they would set up their DLs, driver's license, out of those post office box locations back then.
Well, and we would note that on surveillance too. Surveillance would take them to these little mom and pop mailbox places, watch them go in and come out with mail. So, we knew that's where they had a box. That's where what Tom was describing, many times we were trying to find out what name they were operating at that mailbox. So we would serve a search warrant or a subpoena asking for every name of every box holder they had because we didn't want to tip them off just in case they were friends with one of the subjects. Yeah, that was, one of those, the longest day ever from, morning till all the way through following the truck, finding the load, preparing the arrests. and then sending people out to do the arrests. So nobody slept for the entire next day, till in the evening.
And if you task somebody to do your surveillance, you're running a risk of just losing everything. So we had our own guys out there. And I remember being out there at some point, and we would just turn the cars off back in a distance because we knew how disciplined. And sure enough, Nando came by. Was it 2 or 3 times that night, Vince?
Yes.
Yeah. And he was checking. He was checking to see if anybody was there. He's looking for cars at a position that hadn't been there earlier.
Wow. So he's coming by the warehouse in the middle of the night. Did he come by during the time that you were inside drilling the cylinders?
I don't think so. I think he was home in bed by then. I think somebody put him to bed because he was staying in an apartment over on Miami Beach.
Hey, and of course I know what putting him to bed meant, but just for listeners,
for the listeners, making sure to follow him back to his house and watching the lights go out. Well, although he was in an apartment, but no movement afterwards. So we figured at that point, we always use that term, putting him to bed, following back to home, and he was quitting for the day.
And we would have progressive, a series of surveillance agents sitting at choke points. So if any lights were coming down there, we would be able to call that out because we knew the El Ingeniero, who's going to be coming in to dismantle that. So he was the guy who we assumed, and the phrase was cortar de las, or entre the manzanas, between the apples, if you remember, Vince.
Yes.
The red lines is what it was interpreted. And in the pictures there, they had marked it with red strips, and that's where the tacked welded boxes of about 200 kilos each were in the cylinders there.
Yeah, there were red lines on the chlorine cylinders. We didn't know what they were for, but that was to guide the engineer when he cut them open on where to cut.
Between the apples.
Yeah, there were so many things that we intercepted on the wire that weren't clear, and it wasn't until afterwards, and then after we started to get cooperation from people, things made sense. Well, the other thing that I should say is that right after I came out of the warehouse and we went back to the office and we were preparing the arrest packets, our supervisor did come up to us. And again, he was only looking out for our well-being, but he looked at Henry and I and he goes, I am sure glad as hell you didn't listen to me and shut this thing down. And, we got a big laugh out of it. But, that's one of those where, you had to trust the instincts of the guys who were working it. And, Martin and Henry had far more experience than I did, but that was one of those things. You had to trust us, trust the process, as they say nowadays. And it worked out.
Well, good for you. And I do want to, you mentioned the fact that you sent me some photos of the cylinders. You have some wonderful photos from this case. And I just want to remind everyone that I will make them part of the show notes for this episode if they want to check them out. So how many subjects did you end up arresting that next morning? And did you get everyone? Did you get our friend Julio?
Well, we did quite well. As you know, whenever you have to make a last minute judgment to, okay, let's go out and we need to arrest all these people, make sure we know where they're at and pick them up. We did pretty well. But unfortunately, Julio, who happened to be in South Florida at the time, he would split his time between South Florida and Colombia. What we didn't know, and we found out, is anytime a load would come in, he would get out of town. And in this case, he drove up to Orlando and he was sitting, waiting to hear that the load was crowned, that everything came in safely and that they opened it and, there's no interdiction. Unfortunately for us, a couple of the subjects were able to, as we started to pick people off, and you can't pick everybody off at the same exact second, even though you try, he got word from, I think, a relative of one of the subjects that we arrested that the load was seized. And he left Orlando, quickly made it to the southwest border, crossed over into Mexico, and then had a private plane back to Colombia. Probably by the end of the day, he was back at his farm in Medellin.
Had you had somebody on him in Orlando?
We did not. We only knew afterwards because we hadn't anticipated that we were going to be arresting everybody when we started out on October 10th.
That's right.
Yeah, but at 2 a.m, we did send teams out, and we had a team on his house that happened to be, I didn't know it all the time. I found out late in the case, but happened to be about 2 miles from my house here in Parkland, Florida. And we had a team on his house, but when they hit it, he was not there. And we found out that he had gone earlier that day up to Orlando to sit and wait to make sure that everything came in with a load. But how many total do you remember that we picked up on that first morning, Tom?
Yeah, I think we got almost everybody except Carrington, our Spider-Man, and Christian Vasquez.
Did you get Nando?
We did. We were able to get Nando, which was the big fish for us. I mean, Julio would have been the biggest. But if we picked up Nando, who certainly controlled the wholesale here, and then the one that was operating in Houston that had actually been shut down at some point in the course of the case. But he was found at his apartment in Miami Beach along with his wife.
Did he have the mountain lion? Was he the one?
Yeah, well, that was down in Colombia,
Okay.
where they had a pet, a pet mountain lion. But tell them the story of Spider-Man.
Oh, Spider-Man. Okay, so was it Carrington? Was that his name?
Yes.
And he had a couple of different names. And he was involved. I believe he replaced Christian. Christian was compromised, and I'll get back to him in a second. So he was supposed to leave the country. With these very disciplined Colombian cell members, when you're compromised, you're gone. You're out of the country. That's it. You did your part, and they get you out of there ASAP. And never to be seen again, and all the work, and they replace you with somebody else. But back to him. So I believe Carrington, they go to his place, the 15th floor, if memory serves. And in my notes, it says that they beat down the door and they find, great scene, the curtains are flapping in the breeze and they look down, they don't see anything. But
this is a 14th floor apartment, Jerry, 14th floor.
Yeah. And actually, I think it was 15 and he climbed to 14 is
Perhaps,
what the story was later. So he's gone and everybody comes back, sad faced, and I got away, he climbed down and everything else. And then was it Henry who got the idea to just page him and see if we call back?
Well, in the wire room, remember, we were up on wires on everybody's pagers. And he actually paged Julio. Julio received a page. We couldn't tell where he was, but we could still intercept his pager. And the code in it was for Carrington, and the callback number, when they looked it up, was the emergency room at South Shore Hospital
on Miami Beach. And to put it in perspective, Henry would go into this wire room, and we, like Vince said, we took over the wire room. So there would probably be like 6 stations for wires and in a square room. So we had most of those taken up, and he would sort of sit in the center and be like maybe the Wizard of Oz or this oracle who would sit here, and he had all memorized all these little soap operas of the stories, and he could memorize all these numbers and just had that facility for it. I have the opposite. I can't remember the numbers, but I can remember the people. But he would know everybody and explain these things, and he would burst these things out really quickly. And so when Henry spoke, it was like the burning bush speaking, and he'd like, get over there right now. And I can remember getting the story afterwards, but get in there, and I'm using our barely usable phones, and you need to get over to South Shore Hospital right away. So I'm roaring over there by myself, and I think a couple of Miami guys beat me just before getting there. And I got on the phone, and I said, what's going on? And they said, we think this guy's there, and he's going to be beat up, but be careful. There's probably other Colombians there, and they may be trying to get him out of there. And I'm like, okay, that doesn't sound good. So, I walk in there, and I'm trying to be as undercover as possible. I figure out where he's at. And a couple of Miami guys from the SIS had gotten there just before me, and they were pulling security, and they slapped a set of zip ties on him. And he was sitting
on a gurney with a broken leg.
Yeah, a broken leg and a broken back, fractured L1.
So explain this to me again, because you said he climbed down from the 15th floor, and I wasn't sure what you were talking about.
Yeah, it was the 15th floor. So either he fell, again, we're getting this from converted Spanish to English to lore coming from cooperators. But what we got was either he fell from the 15th to the 14th floor, what I have in my notes, but more likely is he fell or tried to jump. And that's what I recall in the later version, about the 4th floor up. And he broke his leg and he broke his back, fractured part of his back. But he climbed down about 11 floors from the outside.
Like Spider-Man?
Like Spider-Man, yeah.
Or were there a fire escape or something?
No, it was luxury apartments and it was balconies. He was going from balcony to balcony, made it to the fourth balcony, slipped and fell, and then somehow with a broken leg and a broken part of his back, made it to either a car or got somebody to drive him to the South Shore Hospital. But the most memorable scene was for his arraignment, them wheeling him in to the courtroom on an ambulance gurney, in handcuffs, handcuffed to the sides of the gurney to be arraigned.
Wow. Okay, he deserves the name Spider-Man.
Yeah, sure does, man. Yep. Impressive. You know, if all things were fair, should have let him go. I mean, you earned your freedom at that point.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
But I think in all that we arrested 11 members of the organization that morning. Julio got away. There were a couple other ones that weren't there.
The only one I can add to it is Christian Vasquez. Kind of funny. He was supposed to go back to Colombia. But he dumped the phone. You know, he's disciplined, and that's what did him in. They shut off the phones. Yeah.
He had no contact with the organization. Yeah.
So he takes his mom and his sister and he goes to Disney World. One day I'm doing a spot check and I grabbed some sheriff's office guys. It was like about a week later. He would have got back to Colombia if he'd known. So we ended up grabbing him up on the back end of it. Their own discipline did him in. Just dumb luck. I don't know.
Yeah, that was one of those things you say, persistence creates luck, but you'd rather be lucky than good, We indicted another 14 in addition to that. So the sweep was quite complete. We were really, really pleased with that. And not only that, but when the arrests were going on, we didn't know how much cocaine was in the cylinders yet, because remember, we left it there. It was only once the guys showed up at the warehouse in the morning to go to work on them and were arrested that the teams moved in. And there's a good one that Tom's in there of them wheeling the cylinders out into a truck that we rented. And Tom, where did you guys then drove them down to?
Yeah, customs set team. It's a contraband exploitation team. Is that it? Yeah. But that's what the CET means. And so they use those high-powered saws and cut them open. And it's kind of a funny vignette with that, where everybody's elated at this point, and everybody's coming down to see the sideshow that's taking place.
This is at the Port of Miami, where their set headquarters is.
And they got great tools there. Vince and I are like-minded in that respect. He cuts open the cylinders like that, but we love tools and, get all excited about that stuff. So now I'm happy. They're cutting these cylinders open with these giant saws and everything else. So they pop open the first one, they pry it open with these other tools, these air tools. These guys are National Guard support helpers, so they're built for drug work and seizures. They rip it open and they're like, 202 kilos in this one. Like, hey, and they're like, okay, here comes the next one. Like, 206. Hey! And they rip up the next one. 160 kilos. Oh man, that's chump change, So,
getting a little greedy there.
Needless to say, they enjoyed their job. It was exciting for them, especially something that large.
That was a great day. Great seizure all the way around. And yeah.
And how many in total did they get out of the 12 cylinders?
It was about 2,000 kilograms, plus or minus a few. I think it was like 19 in change. So well over 4,000 and some pounds of cocaine. And when we say cocaine, it's not the cocaine they're buying on the street. This was from the DEA lab test that we had done on it. It was in the 92, 93 percentile pure cocaine. So this cocaine would be cut, diluted, probably, they call it stepped on 5, 6, 7 times for street use. So the value of this was just incredible. Millions and millions and millions of dollars.
And then going back to, I love that entire exploitation. It's something later in my career I did the evidence response team. I was sort of weaned on forensics, being a cop in between, and my mom being a crime scene technician going back to the 70s. So that always did it for me, and I'm kind of a hands-on tool type guy. Going to this warehouse, everything had a purpose there with this guy, this engineer who got hired to break this stuff down. But what was really impressive to me was the organization in there, where they had these boxes all gridded out with the cities where this was all going to be transported to. And it looked like, like a horror show where you're going to send this stuff to. So I remember St. Louis it was car encoding, if memory serves. Correct, Vince?
Yes.
Yeah. Saturn, I think, meant St. Louis, and I've forgotten the rest of them, but they used car names for the time. And then we broke that code and figured it all out, or perhaps it was sitting there. And like Chevy would be Chicago, for example. And it was all going to get scattered across the United States. So when people say that and they're like, wow, 2,000 kilos, they said, well, have to understand Miami's a transshipment point. We're not talking about Baltimore. Not saying that nobody's bringing it in there, but this is where it's at. This is not street level stuff. These are sophisticated guys that have a very good illegal and illicit business that's on par with an intelligence service. And there's no mistakes being made there. You won't be around very long. So, yeah, I really enjoyed that from my Army time and doing all that, seeing how that was all set up inside the warehouse.
And you can imagine, so when we bring Nando and arrest him and sit down and initially try to talk to him, of course, nobody wants to talk. Nobody wants to cooperate. And, Colombians typically at the beginning like that, they know what's going to happen. If they cooperate, if they have any family in Colombia, they're going to be killed immediately or used to extort. But, we had a set routine that we would do, probably won't talk to us now. I understand that. But just listen to me. Eventually, everybody cooperates because this is a wiretap case and we caught your load. So when we go to trial, if you would be dumb enough to go to trial, all we have to do is just push play on the tape recorder and your own voice will convict you. And we even played a couple tapes for him and showed him some of the surveillance pictures. His eyes were as big as saucers. And as you probably know, Jerry, and for the listeners, the federal time that you do when you're arrested for a crime like this, if your sentence is 10 years, you're pretty much going to do 10 years. If your sentence is 20 years, you're going to do 20 years. You're not going to have like they do in many of the state systems where you only do a percentage of your sentence or get off very early for good time. In the federal system, that doesn't happen like that. And whenever you sit down and explain to the people that we arrested how much time they were facing, for many of them, essentially the rest of their life, for some of the older people that were arrested, they eventually come around and realize that the only way that they can improve their stance, their prospect to get out, is to cooperate. And eventually, everybody cooperated. Nobody went to trial in this case. It wouldn't have made sense. And most of the attorneys in Miami, the skilled drug attorneys, they realized with a case this strong and a wire case, there is no way that they're going to go to trial on it. The judge would hammer them, and they would not get a slight reduction in sentence for acceptance of responsibility, which is about the only way that they can, right at the beginning of the sentencing, receive a bit of a reduction. Of course, if they cooperate afterwards, then we can't promise them a reduction in sentence, but we can always put in a good word, have the assistant U.S. attorney go to bat for them and appeal to the judge that the cooperation on the part of the defendant, not only did he show remorse and acceptance of responsibility, but we can show you results in what his or her cooperation led to in furtherance of the investigation or another investigation.
Did anybody cooperate and help you eventually find and arrest Julio the gun?
Yeah. In fact, everybody cooperated. And based on their cooperation and the intercepts that we had, Julio definitely was indicted, but he hiding back in Colombia. And because this was pre-extradition, there wasn't a whole lot we could do to get him. However, once the extradition treaty with Colombia became viable, and there was still the possibility that we could indict him post-extradition for different crimes that we found out he was involved in, we entered into a bit of negotiations between a Miami attorney that reached out to Julio. The other thing that had happened during this time period is that the wife that Julio had at the time during our investigation, I believe they were divorced or she left him. And he was at this time currently dating one of Colombia's top supermodels, Natalia Paris. And if anybody Googles that name, you she was a model, a supermodel in Colombia, and did a little bit of acting too, I think. And he was dating her at the time. And, she would travel quite a bit. Well, as a fugitive who also had a Interpol red notice out on him, because we would always file that just in case they would decide to leave Colombia and go to Spain or some other country, he decided that perhaps it would be in his interest to cooperate with the United States. And he, surprisingly, actually agreed to surrender himself in 2000.
Wow.
With no guarantee of reduction in sentence. Only that as hard as he would work to help us dismantle some of the other cartel and organizations, we would make the sentencing judge aware of that. So he surrendered himself. We processed him here in the Southern District of Florida. And then he was put out on significant benefit parole, meaning that he could come out, be free, travel at our request, and be working with us. And I'm sure that the gravity of that started to set in shortly after he was here. And he did come up with the supermodel, with Natalia, which they ended up having a baby together. I think the baby was born in the year 2001. And he was giving us information on various drug organizations and traffickers. But, when somebody like that surrenders, somebody that big, word is going to leak out. And word did leak out in Colombia that Julio wasn't captured. He was cooperating. And therefore, there would be a price put on his head. I'll never forget the phone call from him in 2001. It was like late spring, early summer. He said, hey, there's big soccer tournaments going to be going on. And, I want to go back to Colombia and be part of it. And I have some business that I got to do down there with some properties I own. And I warned him as strong as I could. It is not a good idea. I am not directing you to go down. It is dangerous. You're risking your life. And I even appealed to his wife, Natalia. I said, listen, you just had a baby together. It's an infant. Don't you want to grow up to see that baby? And then I called his attorney, who at the time was Joaquin Perez, and I appealed to him. And he goes, I'm talking to him. I'm trying to dissuade him from doing this. I don't think it's a good idea. And naturally, he's probably getting paid quite well from Julio representing him. He doesn't want to lose a client or a money source, but Julio decided that he was going to be safe. He could protect himself. He was well respected down there. He had plenty of people who were loyal to him. And he went down to Colombia. And within days of being down there, I received a call from Natalia saying, I'm worried. Something has happened to Julio. I've tried to reach him. I've called him, but he doesn't answer his phone. And in fact, his phone is now dead. Well, we immediately called our Colombian office and spoke to our legat down there. And he spoke to his sources within the Colombian government. And nobody at that moment had any information on it. And days led to weeks, led to months. I even sent one of our young agents down to check to find out what's going on. And they were able to locate an armored car, a hardened car, because Julio had a business down there that would actually bulletproof cars. Found one of his cars in a ravine, all shot up with bullets, but Julio was nowhere to be found. But we feared he was dead. And the rumor was that he was captured by some of the drug traffickers he was cooperating with, stabbed in the heart, left to bleed out, which is a common way that the Colombian traffickers would kill someone. And then his body was put through a wood chipper. That was the rumor. And again, weeks turned into months, turned into years. And nobody really ever knew what happened to him. And then there were a couple of actual official investigations done starting in 2002. One was by the Colombian government, a group that's no longer there anymore, but it's called DAS. It was like their judicial type police down there. And what they did an investigation into how much he was worth, which he was worth quite a bit of money, like 10 billion pesos he was worth, which is, probably $5-6 million in US dollars, plus all the businesses that he owned. But they also came up with information that indicated that when Julio came down there, he was captured. He was flown in a helicopter to meet his old friend, the AUC leader, Carlos Castaño, who forced him to sign over many of his properties, and then put back on the helicopter and sent back to the traffickers for them to kill him. And back then, the traffickers and Carlos Castaño created a crematorium. There was always a Colombian term. They were going to make somebody disappear. And a lot of people thought, oh, that was just to mean kill them. But no, it meant to make them disappear. They had a crematorium that they would throw the bodies in, and they would be reduced to ashes, and then the ashes would be spread on somebody's farm. And that's probably where the rumor came that, he was spread over a farm. It wasn't in a wood chipper. It was that he came out of the crematorium. And all of the source information indicates that that's actually correct, leaving an infant child behind and Natalia behind.
If only he had listened to your warnings.
Yeah.
And what about his assets? Did the federal government, were they able to? We
were able to take assets that were here, his and Nando's assets that were here, vehicles that they did leave behind, $1 million in a safety deposit box in Aventura that Nando had there. He was so mad that we seized that, and so was his attorney.
Oh, boy.
Because he goes, listen, I worked for that. I go, yeah, but it's drug proceeds. And the attorney was appealing to us saying, but he needs those to pay me, And that's not the way it works,
I remember we got his Harley.
Yeah.
Yeah. He was real upset about that. And I mean, just hours before he was scheduled to pick that thing up.
It was a custom Harley type motorcycle that was being built at a custom fabricator in Boca Raton. And Tom was just minutes before the attorney showed up to try to get it and convert it into money to pay their bill. We took it from them. But all of his assets in Colombia were seized by the Colombian government. And we could have, joined in with it. But, honestly, from an FBI perspective, as long as the money was taken from the traffickers, as long as the drugs didn't get through, we let the Colombian government keep that money. We let customs take credit for the seizure. In the FBI, and, I've been retired 10 years now, but back then it was all about the indictments and convictions. That's really what our job was, to indict people and convict them. Seizing dope doesn't put anybody in jail. Yeah, it takes it off the street, but we concentrated on that. So we didn't fight anybody for the money. And then the money that we did seize here, we shared with Customs, we shared with the city of Miami, we shared it with the Florida Highway Patrol and the police departments that helped us along the way.
Excellent.
That always left the one question: who was the mysterious informant? Who was this man? Because we didn't know his real name, and he would just come and go. And in the searches that we did of all the different apartments, we took as many photos as we could of different people, because they were probably traffickers and would help us identify people to indict down the line. And one of the pictures that Henry came across, he's looking at it, and in the background, there's Julio, there's Nando, there's Julio's wife at the time, Nando's wife, and a few other people we know. Who is standing there but the informant? And so he asked the informant again, do you know these people? Are you related to them? No. And Henry flips the photo around and said, then who is this? And his face turned chalk white. And then he admitted that he was related to Julio.
Wow. Related, a relative working with you all along.
All along. And the only reason that he then came forward and produced his real identity was because he wanted a reward.
Had he received any payment along the way?
None.
Wow.
The only thing that I think we gave him money whenever we visited Colombia once and met him, was for him to be able to purchase some burner phones, because he was as cautious as Nando was, because again, it meant his life. But he did benefit very greatly. We put him in for one of the highest rewards ever received by a drug informant in Miami, because you have to prove to us who you really are, and there's got to be a tax filing on it. He had to produce his real identity, his cedula, which is his Colombian identification card, his passport. And then he eventually moved here to the United States.
Did anyone ever find out that he had been cooperating?
No.
Wow.
No. And that's why we had to be so very cautious in all of the affidavits. And we had to do our best. And Henry and the AUSA were very skillful at writing it in such a way that there was no information, best it was vague, on who this informant was. Because we know that the SOP is that when an arrest, a big takedown like this happens, the affidavits, the search warrant affidavits, the indictments, everything, the attorneys that are here get a hold of them, and probably within an hour, they're faxed to Colombia at that time for them to review to try to figure out, okay, who gave us up? Who gave us away?
Well, this case was a fascinating case review. So many interesting things. You've shared with me some photos of the cylinders. You've shared with me photos of the cocaine seizure. I mean, I've never seen so many detailed photos before. So I'm going to put those in the show notes for everyone to see. But, you talked about how the FBI, was more concerned about the stats and that you gave away some of the seizure money and let other agencies take credit. But you were able to understand the significance of what this case meant to the FBI and DOJ when you received several awards. So yourself and your other co-case agents, Henry Mercadal and Martin Suarez, you received a Miami U.S. Attorney's Office Award, and the city of Miami gave you an award for outstanding investigation.
Yes.
And I understand that also that the Miami division nominated you for the Director's Award, but I guess that year there was a lot of competition.
Well, it was actually, once our ASAC left and another ASAC came in, it was actually, he happened to be working that case. It was a Houston case with a Mexican cartel member. There was a fugitive that they were able to war across the border, but we joked about it. But the intensity of ours and the amount of agent hours that went into it, far different from theirs, but so be it. Just we felt honored that, and I know I did, to be nominated for that. And not that you do it for the awards or anything like that, but I was so very proud of everybody that worked on this case. I mean, even down to our secretary, our rotors. I mean, everybody pitched in to this. And even our forfeiture analysts who were constantly tracking the properties, the money, the vehicles, anything they could possibly seize. I, didn't retire till 2014, but I know just in my time in Miami up until that point, I never saw another case where we had so many people committed to a common ending, and that was the dismantlement of an organization. And nobody complained about working the hours. Nobody complained about working 6 and 7 days a week. And people to this day are still talking about Operation Dilido. But I have to say, one little funny thing that happened is that at the end of the case, it was no longer termed Operation Dilido, even though it began on Dilido Island. Headquarters made us change the name of the case because an assistant director that was in the undercover review committee meeting approving our budgeting looked at the name and thought that the name was a sex device. If you look at Dilido very quickly, the spelling, it's a little different, but he couldn't believe that we were allowed to name a case that. And somebody said, no, sir, it's Dilido, D-I-L, I-D-O, Dilido. It's an island. And he goes, I don't care. I want the name of the case changed. So we had to change it to Operation Chaleco.
I had to say, that is the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard, because I've been looking at this thing, Operation Dilido, for a couple of weeks now, after you sent me the information about what case we're going to talk. And it never crossed my mind that it was, I'll say the word, dildo.
And forever will be.
I just can't believe that he looked at it like a 12-year-old boy and thought that because he saw that, other people would. And I'm calling
Yeah.
the case Operation Dilido. I don't care.
And it has, as far as we're concerned, it always will be Operation Dilido. The other little funny thing that happened that I should say that we didn't know until we started to debrief Nando was we mentioned just how good he was at counter surveillance, which spooked our people to the point that they sat so far away, like Tom, looking at him with a spotting scope instead of binoculars, or just even, looking without any aids, trying to be that close on what's going on. And I'll never forget, I got a surveillance report, where they observed him at the Aventura Mall, which is a large mall near where he lived. And he pulled up to another car. He got out of the car. He took a suitcase out of the back of his car and with a strap, wheeled it up to the car he was meeting with, opened the back door and put it in. Sat in there for a while with that person. And then at some point, cars are going by. They're so far away, they're not sure. They see him back in his car and driving away. So, of course, the assumption is that he had a suitcase full of money or drugs that he provided to somebody. So when we're finally debriefing Nando and running down through all the different things that we saw over the 18 months that we were following him and trying to catch him, the topic of this meeting comes up. And I said, Nando, on this date and time at Aventura Mall, you met a man and you put a suitcase in the back of his car. And he sat and he looked at me and he was just, looking at me like I had two heads. And I said, listen, you've admitted to everything else. You might as well admit to this. Like, is the guy a relative? You don't want to get him involved? He goes, I just don't know what you're talking about. And I said, you pulled up beside his car, according to the surveillance report. I'm showing it to him. You went to your back door. You got the suitcase out. You wheeled it up, pulling it with a strap, and you put it in the back of his car. And he busted out laughing. He goes, that wasn't a suitcase. That was my big black dog. And we had the biggest laugh, and it just showed that the agents were so far away. They were so afraid of getting burned that they couldn't actually see what was taking place.
It was tough. You'd end up on the wire if you got burned on that. That's for sure.
Yeah. But the other thing is, you've worked plenty of cases where the difference between being able to have successful results are the people you're working with, which we had the best people, but also the management was behind us. The SAC at the time was George Clow, a fantastic SAC, would know every agent in the office by his first name and would come by the wire room at 7 o'clock at night while we were still there. Come in and say, Vince, Henry, you need anything? Did you guys eat? I'll get you a pizza. He was truly one of those people that were concerned with it. And then he left partway through 1995, and Paul Phillip took over as SAC. Again, very supportive. But the real star of our support was Jack Barrett, who went on to be inspector up at headquarters. And then actually for a time was the head of the Washington Metropolitan Police Detective Bureau. And was there, I think, during the Chandra Levy incident. But he was 100% behind us. And the guys at Miami PD, our main contact there was a detective by the name of Louis Diazole. Still friends with him today. And to this day, he still talks about this case.
Fantastic. Well, I'm glad that you were able to give them an acknowledgement. And I know that you've also sent me some photos of some of the award ceremonies. And I would like it if you could send me in the names so that we can identify everyone.
Certainly.
And I will include those photos also in the show notes so that we can get to meet some of the other people that were working with you on the investigation.
Okay, certainly will.
All right. We're at the point of the episode where I like to ask my standard question: when and why you joined the FBI?
Well, I joined in 88. I was a policeman at the Richland Police Department in Johnstown, Pennsylvania. I always had thought of becoming an agent, but I had just finished working a bank robbery case with the local bureau guys from the resident agency in Johnstown. And they convinced me to take the test. And, well, the rest is history. And, I was lucky enough to have Joanne Misko, the first female FBI agent, as my recruiter out of the Pittsburgh division, who guided me through the process.
I guess that's my turn. So mom was a crime scene investigator, went through Adam Walsh being snatched and killed, and saw all that. And I grew up with all of that. I went into the Army. I was a light infantry Army officer. And going through Ranger School, I saw Operation Snowcap. And it was one of the things I kind of wanted to do was work at DEA. A friend of mine had died of a drug overdose, freebasing, one of the first ones to go. So it always kind of stayed with me. But when I got out of the Army, they shut down just about the government as well as the FBI at the same time. And so I went over to the police department. Best gift I got, was able to get into the detective bureau pretty early and just got a PhD in investigation and police work and everything else. Stayed right in that same area. And when I was on the road patrol, there was a group of mentally handicapped group home that were being harassed by some local populace. I got called in and asked about all these code violations I had written for some of the neighbors in and around there. And I thought I was in trouble. It was Andrea Colucci and George Crane from Miami office. And they were asking me why I wrote all this stuff. I thought I was really in big trouble. And, everybody's looking in. And it turned out I was going to be the lead witness for a discrimination against housing case. And then I told him my dad was an agent for a few years. And before I knew it, I was signed up. And that's how I got into it. Yeah, and there's kind of a funny story to it. I was one of the first guys to go through the academy when they opened up hiring again. And I guess they froze it around 91. And I come in, and so I'm in between wires. I would get duty agent and all the good stuff the new agent gets. Duty agent, and what was the other one I would get? Oh, the backgrounds. I would get all those. And we're in the middle of a Title III wiretap. And it was just so incongruent, but you had to handle that. So that was my nighttime work, and that was my daytime work in between. So my contemporaries, as the time went on, they would come out and they would go to bank robbery or something else, and they would be checking off their agent's book. And I'm like, well, how do I check off my agent's book? I'm looking through this thing, you had to have your little guidebook, and I'm running on this Title III and barely keeping up at the whole time. And I remember, I think it was Bruce Batch. He calls me over. He goes, give me that thing. He goes, what is it they want you to do? And I said, I got to get all these things checked off. And he's like, no, you don't. And he threw it in the trash.
Bruce was, like a super senior 13. He and Bobby Cassidy worked together. Again, two legends in Miami drug history. And, they kind of marched to their own beat and made their own rules back then.
I had to fish it out and, and get it ready for the inspection. So, but anyway, yeah. I digress a little bit there, but that's kind of what I was dealing with as I walked into this maelstrom. It was a lot of fun. So 25 years, yeah.
When did you retire, and what are you doing now?
In 2020, I retired. We had lockdowns for COVID. I'm not a very good house cat, and I got to be busy doing something. My mother-in-law passed, so everything kind of lined up to come down to Florida and take care of my father-in-law and everything else. And I was mandatory in a year. But I was running the ERT towards the end, something I really enjoyed. We had tremendous success in recovering buried bodies. The MS-13 was killing us. Tremendous people on the team. They're just so dedicated to it.
What office were you in before you retired?
Baltimore, the last 5. And we had a great partnership we got the bureau dog that they kicked out of Quantico, and it went to the Maryland State Police. So we were able to use that body, HRD, human remains dog, to great success to recover a lot of the body. So I really enjoyed what I was doing. Became kind of part of me. And now that I'm retired, so I do a little bit of film work. I just started working cold cases and old things that I heard about and tearing them apart and making phone calls. And before you know it, somebody wants me to be on TV here or a podcast there. And I do a little bit with forensic pieces, accompany some forensic training. The techs are very, very good, but I add my flair to it. Very body course as well. That's right up the alley. And then along the way, I met the president and CEO of the MVAC machine. And the MVAC machine is a wet vacuum that pulls DNA off of porous objects. And they've had tremendous success. So I go out and I deliver the machine and train folks on that as well. So they've got cases, and if you root around a little bit, as old as 50 years old. They just had one down in Broward County. So old, I didn't even know about it. I was a kid when that one happened. But anyway, they about probably 40 years old, and got DNA on old evidence, a pair of jeans that were in the evidence locker of 2 girls that were murdered, I think sexually assaulted too. So that's what I do. So yeah, that's the stuff I do. I do some podcasts with All Things Crime, and I moderate webinars for Forensic, formerly known as Forensic Magazine. So I'll be doing one tomorrow on facial recognition and tattoo recognition. Ademia is going to be presenting, and I just moderate on that. And I'm helping out Michelle Taylor, who is the editor-in-chief of the Forensic, aka Forensic Mag. That's pretty much takes up my time.
Very good. And Vince, Tom was just talking about cold cases and, ones that are going back several years. But your claim to fame is not a cold case. I heard you use this term, but a frozen case. So why don't you tell us a little bit more about when you retired and what you're doing now?
Yeah, I retired in 2014, 27 years, and then I hit the mandatory age. And as I like to say, I was happy laying on the beach, retired, and I get a call from some colleagues in the Netherlands that I worked with. And they said, if you're ready to come off the couch and come back to work, we have a case for you. And I told them, listen, I'm no longer working. We understand that it's not an official case, but they knew about my interest in World War II. They knew that my dad and his three brothers served. They knew that my dad served in Europe. And also a story that I told them of my dad's group liberating a concentration camp in southern Germany at the beginning of May of 1945. Based on that, they said, there is an effort that's going to be done. We would like to see you lead a cold case to try to solve the mystery of what happened to Anne Frank and the people of the Annex, what caused their arrest. And, a lot of people, and even the title of the book that was written about our investigation says The Betrayal of Anne Frank. But when we approached it from a cold case perspective, we didn't want to assume that it was a betrayal. So, we used modern investigative police techniques, everything including profiling, behavioral analysis, they like to call it. I called on a friend, Roger Depew, who was one of the founders of the Bureau's behavioral science unit, and another one of his students that he trained from Europe, that's Europe's premier behavioral science, Bram Mandemir, and just a whole team of historians in that we recruited, put together, and tried to come up with a possible cause of what caused the raid to happen. And, we were told by so many people, historians, experts, there's no records. You'll never solve it. You'll never find any new evidence. It was really giving us a defeatist attitude right at the beginning. But we did our due diligence. We looked at all the probably 30 different possible causes of the raid that were already out there, theories that different people had on what caused the raid. And we subjected them to, law enforcement examination. At that time, there was no evidence because I asked them, where are the reports? Where's the cold case file? Where there really isn't a cold case file. The records are kind of scattered through different archives. We methodically went through it. We did get lucky. We actually decided to speak to the son of one of the detectives that was involved in one of the official police investigations. And the son happened to remember that he found a big box of papers that his dad had from that investigation. And luckily, within those box of papers, which contained even original reports that should have been at the Netherlands Department of Criminal Investigation, but somehow they were in his house, we found a piece of evidence that actually, according to Otto Frank, identified who the possible betrayer was. Just like you mentioned, 60 Minutes did an entire piece on it. In the 60 Minutes piece, they asked me, is there a smoking gun? Are you absolutely certain that you found who betrayed them? And to that, I have to say no. But we came up with the most logical cause. And we identified somebody who had the means, motive, and opportunity to have done it. And our theory that we came up with has the only piece of physical evidence ever identified in anybody's effort to try to look at and solve what caused this arrest.
It was fascinating watching that episode. And I have since been able to read the book that you were referring to, which covers all of your investigation, the cold case investigation. And it's called The Betrayal of Anne Frank by Rosemary Sullivan. And I understand that you worked very closely with her in her writing this book.
Yes, yes. I mean, the original plan was that she would be embedded with us and write it as we were going through. And she was there with us for a while. But unfortunately, at the end, COVID hit, and she's a Canadian author. They had very strict rules. She could not travel. So as a result, what we all had to do, everybody that was a part of the investigation at the end there, my director of investigation, myself, and others, had to work with her. Luckily, we had Skype, we had FaceTime, and we were able to put together the version of the book that was published by HarperCollins. And, it was on the New York Times bestseller list, won various awards, Canadian True Crime Award, won the award in Poland for best historical account from that time period. So, we were very pleased with it. It's published in 20 different languages, available pretty much all over the world.
Well, I will put a link to both the 60 Minutes episode and the book in the show notes for this episode. We've come to the part of the show where I like to give my guest the last word. Tom, why don't you go first?
I got word that, look, you're going over to this case. Vince is going to be a training agent. He's doing a Title III right now. He's real busy, but you're going to learn a bunch from it. And yeah, what an honor it was. And this was the first case right out of the chute for me. Couldn't grasp the magnitude. I just figured everybody worked to this level of case and everything else who were just running and gunning constantly and seeing that vast amount of cocaine. And I was full of myself as a detective walking over to that. I kind of worked a death investigation here and a bunch of robberies and burglaries and knew everything, but I could not believe what I didn't know. And I had to get smart as fast as I could and then, try to contribute to it. But everybody brought so much to the table. Martin was a monster undercover guy who could ferret out truth and nonsense and who was telling the truth right away. And he just had this innate ability to determine veracity when somebody was telling them the truth about something or not. Henry was the numbers genius. And of course, Vince was the maestro and he was running around doing just about everything. So he would have to take time out of his day to stop and listen to my questions about what do I put for Turk on this, in the middle of a Title III. So it's sort of a crazy, tumultuous period, but we learned on the fly and so glad to be a part of this and contribute as best as I could. Yeah, I had a couple of really good cases, but this one's a high watermark for sure. I mean, I've never seen 2,000 kilos since that.
And Vince, what would you like to say?
Well, anybody that watches the news, anybody that has been around lately, the FBI has taken some black eyes. And people will ask me about it. And I try to stay neutral and I say, listen, politics aside, your agents that are in the field offices, they don't get involved in that kind of stuff. They're out there working day in and day out, just like we did, 6-7 days a week. Tom mentioned earlier, after 9/11, we got tapped to do the telephone analysis for the hijackers' phones because at least 12 of them, maybe even 14 at one point, lived here in South Florida. And what better way to determine information about them to exploit their cell phones? The agents that are out there are doing their best day in, day out to do good work, protect the American public. And, I hope that when the listeners to your podcast hear all the good work that's done, that keeps their image of the FBI, what I have of it, which is, the premier law enforcement organization in the world.
And that's the end of the interview. In your podcast app's description of this episode, you'll find a link to the show notes at jerrywilliams.com, where you'll find photos of Vince Pankoke and Tom Myers, links to articles about Operation Dilido, and lots of case-related images, including photos of the chlorine cylinders filled with cocaine. There are also links to more FBI retired case file review episodes about Miami drug cartel investigations. I hope you enjoyed the interview and that you'll share it with your friends, family, and associates. You can show me just how much you liked it by buying me a coffee. There's a link in your podcast app's description of this episode, or you can visit jerrywilliams.com and tap on the little coffee cup icon in the bottom right-hand corner of my website. Don't forget to follow FBI Retired Case File Review on your favorite podcast app. Now, this podcast is all about true crime, but if you're also interested in crime fiction, once a month via my reader team email, I keep you up to date on the FBI in books, TV, and movies. When you join my reader team, you get access to my FBI reading resource, a colorful list of more than 70 books about the FBI written by FBI agents who have been guests on this podcast. There's nonfiction, crime fiction, true crime, and memoirs. You'll also get my FBI reality checklist where I debunk 20 cliches about the FBI and receive news about what I'm up to and about my FBI nonfiction and crime fiction books. I want to thank you for listening to the very end. I hope you come back for another episode of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. Thank you.